Hi, and welcome to this flipped instructional session. This is Middle School Earth Science, SCIO 6 Semester A, and today we're going to talk about Lesson 1.09 Weathering, and I am Mrs. Fessel. Remember to watch this flipped lesson before coming to the live Class Connect flipped follow-up. Keep an eye out for the flipped follow-up on your class schedule. So today we're going to talk about weathering. So the definition of weathering is it's a process that breaks down big rocks into smaller ones. So there's a couple different ways this can happen. Physical forces, if you think about physical, something that's actually like hitting it and breaking the rock. If you get physical, you might hit something. So the same thing. The wind and the water is hitting the rock and wearing away at it. And this is also sometimes called mechanical weathering, which is what we're going to call it today. Then we have chemical processes. So if you think about the name of this, it has to do with chemicals. There are chemicals and different compounds out there in nature that can break down rocks. So this is called chemical weathering. Both of these types of weathering usually start with a natural crack in the rock. If you think about if the rock already has an area of weakness, that's a perfect spot for weathering to happen. So a little bit more about mechanical weathering. So as I said, mechanical weathering is the physical force that breaks down a rock. So one example that you might not think about is water and ice. So if you think about that natural crack in the rock that we just talked about, water is going to seep into a crack in the rock. When water freezes, it expands. If you've ever put anything in the freezer or if you made ice cubes, you might notice that they actually expand or get bigger. If you put, for example, a glass of water into the freezer, it might break the glass as the water freezes and expands. So ice and water can break down the rock as part of mechanical weathering. So other ways that weathering happens is water. Flowing water and waves hitting the shore day after day can break rock pieces off cliffs and riverbanks. Plants actually have a big role in weathering. Plants and tree roots can push into cracks in a rock and break it apart. If you've ever seen trees or plants clinging to rock faces, they're probably breaking them down. Going from hot to cold quickly, or the opposite, cold to hot, puts stress on a rock. Heat makes things expand, and the cool could make the rock contract. So an example of this might be if you've ever heard the pipes in your house, when the heat comes on, you might hear them make noise as they expand. The same thing can happen to rocks and actually crack them. In a desert, tiny grains of sand and other rock particles that get carried by the wind will hit the rock's surface and wear them away. And also even animals burrowing into the rock can wear them down. So we're just going to go into a little bit more detail about a couple of them. So here you can see the roots breaking down the rock. Sometimes it's called root pry. The tree will grow in the rock, and the rock may break apart because of the tree roots. Here, this is Bryce Canyon in Utah. Frost and the ice may have broken these rocks into these unusual shapes, kind of how we talked about that the water expanding and freezing and expanding can break down rocks. So these unusually shaped rocks at Bryce Canyon National Park. Here is another example. I think this might be the Badlands up in South Dakota. These rocks have been blasted by wind and sand, causing them to become rounded. So that's one of the major ways that wind weathers rocks, is it picks up tiny particles, hits against the rocks. As that sand and dirt gets picked up by the wind and blasted into the rocks, it can cause them to become rounded. You might have experienced this if you've ever been at the beach or someplace sandy on a windy day. You know that when the wind picks up those sand particles and they might hit against your face or your arms or your legs, it can hurt. the same thing is happening to the rocks. The sand particles get picked up, crashed into the rock, and after millions of times of this happening, the rock is breaking down. All right, so now that we've talked about physical or mechanical weathering, we're going to talk about chemical weathering. So as we said, this is the breaking down of rocks by a chemical process. So chemical weathering actually affects the atoms of a rock. So plants are one thing that can cause mechanical and chemical weathering. So a lichen is kind of almost like a moss-like plant, and it actually produces an acid that can dissolve the rock surface that the lichen is growing on. So if you look right here, these are lichens in this picture right here, and they may be releasing acid and actually breaking down the rock. Where this plant right here might be performing mechanical weathering on the rock by its roots breaking it down. Chemicals in rainwater can cause rocks to break down, especially if there's pollution and that pollution has caused acid rain, then that can break down rock. Finally, rocks can even rust. So if you see this bottom picture here, the reddish rocks, this happens when oxygen, iron, and water are present. There is a reaction that causes the iron to react with the oxygen in the air and create rust with its reddish brownish color. So that rock is actually rusting due to chemical weathering. Here's another example of chemical weathering through rusting. In this case, it can also be called oxidation. So the oxygen, that's where the word oxidation comes from, reacts with water and turns the rock red. Here's a great example of, on a rock statue, how acid rain has eaten away at this limestone. Limestone can react with the acid in the rain, and so this statue of a woman in just, it looks like about 60 years, becomes almost unrecognizable because of the acid rain. Most often, these two processes, chemical and mechanical weathering, are working together to wear away at the rock. Mechanical weathering kind of, if you think about it as a hammer, kind of breaks the rock into smaller pieces. As those pieces of rock become smaller, the inside of the rock becomes exposed to acids and other chemicals. So then that gives chemical weathering a chance to take hold. The opposite can happen. Chemical weathering can weaken the rocks, making them more likely to undergo mechanical weathering. For example, if an acid forms holes in a rock, like we see right here, then water might get into those holes, freeze, expand, and push the rock apart. So different climates can cause different rates of weathering. For example, a warm climate the rocks are gonna weather a lot quicker because a higher temperature and more moisture can cause quicker weathering. In a place where there's a lot of change between night and day, freezing and not freezing, there can be a lot of thawing and freezing that can cause the rock to break down. So depending on the climate, the rock can break down at different rates. Here's an example of Cannon Mountain in New Hampshire. People have thought that this rock formation looks like a man right here. Kind of there's his nose, his mouth. Here would be his eye and his forehead, kind of. So weathering broke down this rock and the entire structure collapsed. Thankfully, it was in the middle of the night and no one was there, but a definite example of weathering. Why is weathering important? One of the most important things is it all leads to soil. Believe it or not, all the soil that you see out there is broken down rock. that has turned into clay, silt, and sand, then combined with water and air to form soils. So weathering is important. And the other very important thing to remember about weathering is only the breaking down of rock. Erosion, which we're going to talk about in the next lesson, is what actually moves that rock around. So weathering is just the breaking down of rock. All right, this ends our flipped instructional session. So look for the flipped follow-up on your class schedule. Attend that live flipped follow-up to practice this topic. If you need help, attend the Help Lab sessions, and as always, have fun learning. Thank you and have a great day.